Welcome to the Jewish Education Experience podcast with your hosts, Yasmina and Ari, who will be uncovering gems of wisdom with Jewish educators from around the world.
To our audience, thank you so much. We really appreciate your support, and we appreciate you sharing our podcast with others also. Please consider supporting our podcast financially by contributing via Zelle, jewisheducationpodcast@gmail.com, or by joining our Patreon community, www.patreon.com/Jewish Education Experience Podcast. And to all of you Jewish educators and students of Jewish education around the world, chizchu ve'imtzu. May you be strengthened and encouraged in your holy endeavors. Please remember to hit that subscribe button so that you'll be notified whenever we post a new video. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this podcast may not necessarily be those of the hosts. Our guest today is Rabbi Chaim Galfand. Hello, Rabbi Galfand. Welcome to the podcast, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you very much, Yasmina and Ari. It's great to be with you.
All right, let's get right into it. Will you please tell us a bit more about yourself and how you began your journey in education?
Certainly. So maybe I'll start with the second half of that, which is how this all began. And I didn't really realize it at the time, I suppose, but the seeds got planted when I was in elementary school. And I'm not being silly or sarcastic when I say that, but it began by my going to a Jewish day school as a child. And in a minute, I'll get to where that piece of the puzzle fits in. But it took a long time for those planted seeds to germinate, I guess. So after elementary school at a conservative Jewish day school, a Schechter school, I went on to a middle school and high school in Philadelphia that was a community day school. And following that time, I went off to college and went to law school, and I became a lawyer. And as far as I knew, that was going to be my path through life. But it was really because I ended up in a Philadelphia law firm in a particular situation that everything started turning full circle. So the path to Jewish education began when my second part of the day as a lawyer began. It was around 6 o'clock, and I was going to be putting in more hours. And I was heading to the law firm's library, and the chairman of the firm literally grabbed me by the sleeve and he said, look, I'm hosting a reception for the American Jewish Committee. He said, you're Jewish and I need more warm bodies in there. And so I walked in, and the chairman of the firm says, I need you, and you're a first-year lawyer, you go. And I went and I smiled, and I ended up joining the American Jewish Committee that evening. And I ended up on a steering committee to form a young adult division. And I suppose at the time I was looking to say, all right, maybe I can develop some business in all of this. And we came up with a name for the group called Bridges. And we then quickly came up with, well, what would the bridges potentially be? And we talked about bridges between Philadelphia Jews and Jews in other countries, between Jewish communities within Philadelphia, between Jews and other religious and ethnic groups in Philadelphia. And then just because I wanted sort of the balance of four, I added in the bridges between an individual Jew and their own heritage, culture, or tradition. And I didn't realize that that was going to end up being what grabbed people. And over the next couple of years as a lawyer, I began finding that I was giving more and more of my time on the volunteer basis towards this young adult division of an organization that was ostensibly about civil rights and human rights, but where we had all of these young Jewish professionals who were sort of hungering for something. They wanted us to focus on that fourth bridge, the link between an individual Jew and their own tradition. Mm-hmm. And it was in hearing those rumblings of a hunger to learn that it was starting to stir something within me. And this goes back to those seeds, because I started thinking, I've been in Jewish day school my whole life, but when I think of something that kind of resonates on this most natural, warm level, it was the elementary years. So it's kind of like that old adage of, give me a child for the first, 8 years of their life, and I'll give you a Catholic for life. Well, that works pretty much for every tradition when you kind of focus at those ages. So we began to do some learning. And I found that I had maybe a little bit more to give than some other people because I had had this rich jewel of education. And hearing myself kind of talk more with the group and share more, I started realizing maybe this is something that I want to do with my life. And I started exploring it. And at first I was thinking maybe a master's in Jewish education. I really wasn't quite sure. And then 2 years after that, my father passed. And in sitting Shiva and in the conversations with the rabbi who helped us through that, I decided that I would approach my future maybe with rabbinical school. And, it was in rabbinical school that I discovered Camp Ramah. Now, I had gone for 2 years when I was very young, when I was 11 and 12, but I hadn't been one of those camp kids that go all the way through and is on staff.
You weren't a Ramanic?
I was a Ramanic for those 2 years, but then I went back as a grown-up to teach. And it was my first experience, really, with any sort of teaching. And what was extraordinary about it was that combination of informal and formal, because it was a blend of kids during the summertime where they just want to have fun and they're expecting to spend their glorious summer at camp, but then they're told, well, you got to be in class for a period every day.
Right.
So I was handed this binder of lesson plans, or maybe lesson outlines is a better way to put it, and said, go teach. And it was my first time starting to realize this relationship. And I think I thought of it as a dance at the time between the information that you're trying to transmit and the person doing the transmitting. And I'm absorbing this material and I'm passing it along. And that was kind of how I saw it at the time. So that was my entree sort of into education. And then as I went through rabbinical school, I spent 2 more summers after that at Camp Ramah. But it was in my the start of my 5th and final year at the Jewish Theological Seminary that I got a phone call out of the blue. And it was in October, so it was 4 months before the usual interviewing season. And it was from a head of school of a Jewish day school in Philadelphia. Coincidentally, the day school that I went to.
Wow.
And he said, I don't know you, but I was talking with somebody on one of our parent focus groups because we're thinking of starting a middle school. And I think we should have a rabbi at that school. And they said that I should talk to you.
That's so interesting.
We met for coffee and I was offered the job, even though I had never worked in a school. So what I do now started with no education courses, except for one, a class on how to teach theology with Professor Neil Gilman and Dr. now Rabbi Steve Brown. And I've been with Perelman Jewish Day School ever since, the school that I went to as a child and where now my own children have gone and where I have the delight of working day in, day out.
Wow, it really came full circle there.
Yeah. I find it really interesting. You mentioned that the formative years in elementary school, but then you ended up in middle school. So do you find that there's the kids are kind of baked by the time they get to middle school?
Well, they're capable of a more abstract level of thinking. So there is a lot of fun with being at that middle school segment. But I do believe you have to really want to be a middle school teacher. And I'm not sure everybody's cut out for it. Mm-hmm. Admittedly, I was there for 2 years. And it was then that I went back to the head of school and I said, look, we've got this incredible 145 student middle school, and it's terrific. But I said, we've got hundreds of kids in our 2 elementary schools. And I said, we need to build from the bottom up. So we brought in a wonderful educator to take that spot in the middle school. And then I transitioned to our 2 elementary level schools. And I began working with students in all grades. Then it was kindergarten through and including 5th. And we now have a 4-year-old class. So we have a pre-K. And it's different every year because it really depends on who's there in front of you in the classroom.
Right. Okay, so you're saying by the time you get to middle school, it's not too late. You haven't missed the boat.
I don't think it is, but you're right in the sense that there is a foundation that gets laid. And opportunities are still there if a window hasn't been closed shut. And I don't want to say that a window closes on its own just developmentally, or as kids go through that transcendence time and they approach adolescence. I think the greater risk comes from the window being slammed shut by others, by their peers, by what they read and see in the world around them, sadly by teachers, by parents. And there are so many factors that sometimes rise up against children that when they arrive at that moment and their own sense of adolescence is taking hold, where they want to individuate and they're more likely to sort of push against. I think all of those sort of come to create that perfect storm where for some kids, it is too late, but not for all. And I think that's where patient, kind educators really excel.
Nice.
Do you think even for those kids, maybe you think that, okay, maybe it's too late, maybe they missed the boat, or maybe something turned them off? Do you think down the line there's potentially something that can re-inspire them to come back?
Oh, absolutely. Meaning when we think of the college outreach work that's being done by Hillels all across North America, when we think about the institutions such as Pardes in Israel that are able to take kids that are post-college, I think that as long as there's a little bit of that spark somewhere in there, I think that it can be fanned into something larger.
Okay.
A lot of what I do at the school, I love telling stories, right? And this is that story of the apprentice to the blacksmith, and he's taught how to do everything with all of the tools and how to shape all of the metals. And he sort of, comes back after his first day on the job on his own, and he says, I failed miserably. I couldn't get the fire to go. And the guy said, did you use the bellows? And he said, I did. He said, well, was there a spark already going? And he said, well, no. And he said, remember the bellows, and it's only going to help you if you can fan something that is already there.
Right.
I'm trying to decide at this point in my life, is it really true, right? Can we only fan something that's a spark that's existing, or do we have to be in a position where sometimes we ignite something and then fan it? I don't know. That's a little bit of that chicken and egg kind of discussion. But no, to answer the question very clearly, it's never too late, but a lot of opportunity can get lost.
Right.
Meaning if you can take all of those years when kids are really trying to step back from the adults in their lives, especially their family, and become their own person, what if they could really be attached to their educators as inspiring models and say, as I'm developing myself, that Jewish piece is going to be a part of my core. And it's because it's not coming from my family. It's not being imposed. When you're dealing with that age range, if you lose them then, you could potentially lose them all through high school. You could lose them until maybe 9th or 10th grade, when sometimes they can engage again. But it's a shame if you can't do it before they head off to college. This is not necessarily a podcast on Israel education, right? But that's one of the discussions of, do we do our children a disservice by not focusing in on the complexities of the Israel question? And then they head off to college and they feel, wait a minute, I'm finding out more facts. And was I lied to? Maybe all of the positive or only positive images that I got, the hugging of Israel, maybe I need to be skeptical of all that. What if the same sort of a model holds with, the Jewish piece? Because I'm thinking very much about kids that go to a Jewish day school. And I'm in a way an example of that. When I got to college, I was not necessarily looking to continue along my Jewish journey. In some ways, I felt like I might have had enough. And it was those elementary years that I think were the roots that held me still, that kept me fast. Because for me, I had to come back to it. I often think about this as whether you're going to really be able to rope people in, like the cowboy with the lasso pulling in somebody, or whether you should have the model that is so magnetic that it just draws people in of their own accord. I think
Yeah.
with that latter image, the success rate is probably greater, though I recognize we could measure success differently. So
For sure.
Wow. All right. Yeah, Israel, certainly that's a major topic, and maybe we can come back to that at a certain point. But we'd like to know, who are the educators that you particularly admire?
oh wow. Well, I would say I started talking about stories. So I would say Rabbi Eddie Feinstein, because anything he writes, but also any story that he tells. And he's an educator who's equally adept with children that might be knee high and with adults who are, very well educated. So I admire his ability to handle all sorts of learners and to do so engagingly. I would say somebody like a Rabbi Aryeh Ben David, now with the organization Ayeka, and he has this emphasis really on engaging learners less in the region of the head and more in the region of the heart. He has a wonderful book called Becoming a Soulful Educator, and really a must read for those listeners who sort of want to think about education from the side of the soul and not just from the cognitive standpoint. I'd probably add Dr. Ron Wolfson, because he's been out there preaching how we have to really genuinely care about people, right? How we have to welcome them and how we have to listen to them, and how ultimately that sort of treatment can create communities of belonging and blessing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you've got that sort of an assertion from somebody like a Ron Wolfson, that you can connect people to Judaism by connecting them to community, I think it starts to give you a blueprint for how you want to move ahead. 2 years ago, I had a wonderful experience at the Song Leader Boot Camp, which was really created and now driven with his passion and his heart by Rick Recht out of St. Louis. All of the educators who use their music to open eyes and doors, I so admire them, whether they are the Rabbi Yosef Goldmans of the world or Rabbi Josh Warshawskis of the world. So many people who, through music, have helped me discover a piece of myself that I think I hadn't paid enough attention to.
Mm-hmm.
So, and maybe I'll even throw in there, just because the idea of God's love is extremely important to me. And when you have somebody who is a very powerful theologian and a serious, Talmid Chacham, Rabbi Shai Held, when he can take some of his powerful acumen and devote it towards what God's love really can look like in this world, there's another educator that I would deeply admire.
For sure. Well, I'm glad you mentioned God, because we were also thinking you work with various age groups at Perelman. How does God come up? How do you typically talk about God with your students?
So hopefully I'll get a chance to add a little bit more about this later. But this year I'm actually doing an initiative which is called Make Room for God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because in all of my teaching, I started realizing that we teach a lot of Torah and we teach a lot of, dinim and minhagim, the laws and customs of Jewish life, and especially of the holidays. And we have experiences through the year, but we weren't really overt about what it means to experience God, and that we weren't making room for God. And it's if I sort of say the only God we were making room for was, Noah's God, the one who flooded the entire world and killed everything in it but the fish. That's a lovely, scary portrait to hold up to 6-year-olds. And yet the number of teachers that do so, and the number of books that exist that sort of put that out there as one of our earliest, images of what God is going to be, I have to sometimes wonder if we're creating a lot of scar tissue that we're going to be unable to break up later on. And that scar tissue is going to kind of serve to be restricting the movement of our students. So I try to be really careful about talking about God. I don't want to necessarily talk about the God that creates the world in 6 days, from separating light to creating a human, because that has also certain limitations. There are ways to frame it, and especially, and I'll be honest, I know it's not for every school, but for me in my school, to look at that as inspiration, to look at that as metaphor, to look at the question not of Torah as how was the world created, but why was the world created? Those are the questions which I think are as much of interest to me personally as they are to kids. And so I think we have to be very careful about how we talk with kids. And I do work with 4-year-olds up to and including 11-year-olds.
Okay.
And the gap is big, but not as big as we might think. I always recall the expression from law school from a professor who he would speak of using testimony in the courtroom and the procedure by which you bring that testimony in. And he used to say you have to be really careful because you can't unring the bell, by which he meant that once you hear something, it can be so unrealistic to say, oh, just ignore what you heard. So when we teach something about God at a young age, I think we have to be thinking about what's going to happen when they are in middle school.
Right.
Is that going to be the sole picture that they have of God? And knowing that for so many of our adults in the Jewish community, the last time that they were really involved with their own Jewish lives in any serious way might have been their time when they were bat or bar mitzvah.
It's true.
And if that's where they were still with the image of God, then it shouldn't surprise us that God's not really on the radar for so many of our grown-ups. I can say to, like, I actually teach what I would call theology to our second graders. I don't call it theology, of course, right? But we take the 18, the Shmona Esrei, which is really called the 18, but it's these 19 blessings which make up the Amidah, or our central devotional prayer. And I say these 19 ideas are the big ideas of being Jewish, and nearly all of them connect in some way to aspects of what we would call God. And I start to bring children along to the point where they imagine the name tag, the kind where you go when you go to a convention or something and it says, my name is. And I say, imagine that you've got a name tag that says, my name is God. What would you put that on? And if you were to ask older kids, if they haven't had opportunities to showcase what they feel and what they think, and this is the thing, I believe kids are so powerfully connected to a sense of what is godly in this world and what is spiritual. We often close the door on that, often unintentionally, because we're a little bit scared to talk about it, because we as parents, we're not really sure ourselves. We haven't done our own due diligence for ourselves. And so we say, yeah, I don't really know anything about that, instead of saying, you're asking great questions, and we should start to look at them together and keeping an open-ended approach to our kids. But I say to kids, when have you felt, that you were in a moment where you were connected to something much greater than yourself? Well, that's different than saying, tell me about the God you believe in, little second grader. That doesn't work so well. But you have to start coming up with different ways to look at that topic and then say, so that feeling that you expressed, maybe we can put the God name tag, my name is God, on that. Because God is simply a label for that which might link all of us. God is simply that name tag by which we call something which existed before there was anything. All of the different ways that we might start to conceive of God, they all get that name tag. And it's not a stretch for kids to say, but wait, God can be all of those things. Some of those things are opposite. That God is who you turn to in your closest moment, but yet God is also that which is more powerful than anything. These are opposites, right? It's the near and far. It's the immanence and transcendence. But we know that God can be both of those. And to try to draw that out from children at the earliest of ages is super important because they already know. They know about God. They may never have known what to call it. That sense of wonder when they're sitting there looking at a leaf or watching a caterpillar and they feel in awe of something. We have more to learn from them than they have to learn from us. And we as grown-ups are often more at fault for the shutdown of that innate sense of curiosity and feeling of connection. So, when you ask, what do I do with different ages? I guess in order to initiate a meaningful exchange about God, I think adults need to demonstrate a respect for young children that really acknowledges and affirms their ability to make meaning of the world around them. We have to give them credit. And I think this kind of a worldview is going to be the one that doesn't underestimate them. It doesn't belittle their ability to express wonder about existential issues, not that they would be able to call it that. And their ability to sort of pose pretty darn sophisticated questions. And I think you then have to appreciate the fact that kids possess different modes of expression, certainly amongst themselves, and oftentimes different than adults. And so sometimes it means stepping back and simply giving them the room. And if you're willing to accept that premise, then I think adults should consider ways to explain concepts using analogies, using art, using stories, using dramatic play. And in that way, we start to get into a deliberation with young children about theological questions in ways that are going to allow them to express themselves a little more coherently. But if we're talking about Jewish education, this needs to start then with our educators starting to think about where they are. Because we've got some incredibly well-educated, gifted Jewish educators who haven't really themselves thought about the God piece. So when I think about this idea of make room for God, it was just a catchy title, but I wanted people to think about, what does it mean to make? How do I make room for God? Or what about the word room? Is that room that is in my heart only? Is it room that's in my mind? And what do we mean by God? And so all of those elements, I'm sort of asking people to play with and to see what it feels like for them. And with educators, we need to provide professional development programs that are going to start to give them the knowledge, resources, the confidence to start to really address their own theological positions.
So I've heard there's this Jewish educational tradition to begin teaching the youngest children, I'm assuming maybe 4 or 5, with Vayikra, with the Torah portions of Leviticus. How do you feel about that?
So I will say that we are certainly teaching Torah to our first graders. The kids, when they're younger, will get Parashat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion. But we are going through, certainly starting from 2nd grade onward, with the books of the Bible. And that does include Vayikra. We're not starting with it, but in many ways, what makes that so appropriate is its very sense of Kedusha, in its literal sense, holiness, but also apartness or separateness, otherness, that there are different realms and that there are sometimes moments and actions that we experience, which can give us a better sense of that apartness. But that's what kids are able to sense at those tenderest of ages, that there is something beyond us. There is something greater than us. There are moments that are qualitatively different. And I wish that our parents, right, because we only do so much at the school level. The home is a significant opportunity. And if I were to say to kids in younger grades, so what do your parents like to do in terms of vacations? Kids will know. What do they like to watch in terms of television? Kids will probably know. What's their favorite flavor of ice cream? They know. Do they think about God? I have no idea. And I'll say, which do you think is more important? And the kids 201 will say, well, if they think about God,
Right.
of course that's more important. And I'll say, how come you don't know? And it's the combination of they don't tell me or I never asked.
Yeah.
And I'll say, that's a pretty small hill to climb, isn't it? All you have to do is ask.
Yeah.
And then all the parents start emailing me saying, what did you do? That's Pandora's box. And it was looking so lovely on the shelf. But this is how you make change, is you don't just work with children, but you bring the family into it. But then you're also there as a support for them. You're not sort of hanging them out to dry at the end of the branch.
That's true. And it ties into what you said before also. Then, you're opening that box, but then parents also have to be so careful if they're not sure about where God is in their mind and their lives, and being so careful to not turn off their children when they do eventually have that discussion. So how do we help them, I guess? How do we arm them with that?
So Yasmina, it's a secret. Don't tell anybody, but I kind of give the kids a little bit of a hint that this might be a little bit scary for some of their parents because they don't go to our school and they don't have the chance to sort of be talking about this as openly as we do. So I said, you have to be patient with your parents, and I lead them down that path of understanding that it's not a single conversation. It's, and I'll be honest that sometimes with kids, I'll say, sometimes we as grownups, how we get so busy that we sometimes give you the message that we don't have as much time for you. And they say, yeah. And I'll say, life is busy. But I said, we were all once kids. And we all looked at that leaf with the same amazement that you did. Or we, played with, those things with the same sense of, I can do anything with these. We were once you, and you may have to help us discover that part of ourselves again. So we empower them to be the ones, not just sort of interviewing their parents, certainly not grilling their parents, but saying, well, maybe I can help to open the discussion with my parents.
Right.
Yeah, This is definitely fascinating. And I know we would love to see, when that God curriculum comes out, we would love to see that.
It involves everything from bibliodrama to journaling. So it's a variety of things.
Wow. Okay, well, so education, right, in Hebrew, chinuch, can be an amorphous term. How do you define education?
Okay. So I mentioned my summer when I first started at Raman. I sort of said there's this, what I thought of like a dance between the information being transmitted and the person doing the transmitting. But I think I see it differently now, because that was very early on as I was making my turn into education. Now I see education much more as facilitating and certainly not transmitting. So I think when I think of chinuch, I think of maybe its basic meaning, which is training. And that's not to say that there's not a place for relaying details. There certainly is, but I've come to see education as the feeding of an intrinsic curiosity, that you're there facilitating someone in their quest to discover the things about which they're curious. And it's funny because I love Hebrew, and I've often thought about that line from the Shema, from the V'ahavta paragraph, where it says V'shinantam livanecha. We say you will diligently teach your children, but V'shinantam is from the word shinaim, from shen, from teeth. Right? You're going to grind this material up so that people can properly digest it. Right? So chinuch it's interesting because chanichaim is the Hebrew word for gums. So not to say that chinuch is gumming up the works. I would never say that about education. But it's the idea that it has to do with what we take in. And one of the questions about chinuch is maybe whether it's connected to the word palate, from the word chech, which is an old Aramaic word, that the idea that you kind of are going to take a child that's going to begin nursing, and you're going to rub like a paste of dates onto the palate of their mouth. So it's going to begin the suckling process, right? It's the idea of priming the pump, of starting the process. And so maybe we can say chinuch is a little like that. that we're connected to starting something. We're used to the idea of chinuch being starting if you connect it to something like Chanukat HaMishkan,
Right.
the initiating of our journey with God in our midst in a more concrete way. So maybe my question would be, is it okay if I talk about education as, what's the journey?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not generalizing to science or to math, though I think holiness resides there as well. But for me now, I see chinuch as guiding people to the paths along which they're going to travel to discover their place and their purpose in the universe.
Wow,
And
I really like that.
Yeah, really great answer.
And I like how you mentioned about the Hebrew, because we interviewed recently a colleague of ours, Dina Eliezer, and she also mentioned about Hebrew and words, and she connected the same thing that you did about how important the Hebrew language is and how it all ties together. So how would you?
She enlightened us about the gums too.
About, yeah.
We really like that.
Ah, good.
How do you help your students appreciate the Hebrew language? Because here we are, we live in America, we're speaking English. Why am I learning this language that I'm only hearing in school? How do you get your students to understand Hebrew, to connect with it more? How do we do a better job?
And if I can maybe just pack onto that, just because I'm curious, did you develop your love for Hebrew also in elementary school, or did that come later?
So this is the challenge, Ari, because I literally was having a coffee with one of my closest friends, a classmate from rabbinical school. We sat this morning and we were having coffee, and he too is a Jewish educator. And I said, generationally, we're in a different place. I grew up at a time where we drilled, on the conjugation of verbs. And we had to, every time we were reading Hebrew, we were pulling out the shoresh, the root or the base word. And then we got into middle school and we were looking at modern and ancient poetry. And we were looking at Hebrew songs, classic and modern.
Wow.
And it was hard. And I said, we're not going back to that. Rare is going to be the level of students that there are enough of them, and you've got a teacher that appreciates that style of learning. So I think that that's gone to some extent. But what I love is we've got third graders at our school, and every year we give a book as the grade level book. And what we give to our third graders is the Jewish Publication Society Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible. And we don't give it as a third grade book. I say, I think you know enough now in third grade that you can start to appreciate this book, which is the book that will accompany you through life. And we often go through the English so that they can see the word that they don't understand. And then I say, let's turn to the Hebrew. And they start to realize that there's something about knowing Hebrew that's going to unlock different doors.
Nice.
So to sort of take something from the book of Vayikra, from Leviticus, that you're not supposed to sort of, profane the name of God, right? We think of it as a Chilul Hashem. And they don't know what profane means, just like they don't know what sanctify means. Right. So the English is almost not helpful. Mm-hmm. But when you start to take that root word of Chet Lamed Lamed, halal, and they start realizing that it means, outer space, or a halalit is a spaceship. And we start to bring them to the point that, a halal is a soldier on the battlefield who's been pierced by a spear. And it's the idea that it becomes a place that is empty. So now they realize, so a Chilul Hashem is emptying out God's name.
Wow.
That's much better than profane. And then, of course, I can say to them, and what's profanity? And they say, I don't know. And I say, you know what cursing is? And they all go, yes, I do. And you say, right, and I know all of those words, and I don't use them because they're empty. That's profane language. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden, Hebrew from the earliest levels can start to be valuable. Now also, when they arrive at our school, they're hearing Hebrew music that's playing. And at lunch or recess, they're hearing Hebrew music that's playing. Mm-hmm. And, they're always learning Hebrew songs. And, they're not the classic ones that I grew up with. The classic, often kind of old school Zionist songs. they're learning some of those, but they're learning more modern stuff.
Okay.
And that helps to kind of give it a certain cachet, especially nowadays where the songs are accompanied by videos. And you can curate those a little bit, right? So the cool Hebrew goes with those cool people they're seeing on the screen. So maybe we do have some opportunities that didn't exist, but I don't think we're going to quite get to where we once were.
Good one. Wow.
Like,
So, Rabbi Galfand, what's the biggest challenge that you faced as an educator?
Oh, starting middle school. But no, I mean, so I'd never been in a classroom, and it was that tachlis practical challenge from early on of how do I begin to learn the pieces that a classroom educator has to manage.
right.
So I would have said, gee, that was my biggest challenge. But I want to say that, and I might even connect this to the Hebrew, right? That I was reading in the paper this morning about the proposals and expectations for a national infrastructure bill, right? Because our roads and bridges, they're crumbling. And of course, I'm thinking, oh, yeah, and we've got bridges that are in danger of collapse now too, right? Those bridges that connect some of our text skills with our ability to try and reach a sense of deep meaning.
Right.
And so that challenge, I think, is trying to get kids to connect to Jewish text. Because we are always going to face that question of, so why should I be Jewish?
Right, for sure.
And I don't love the question as much as I love the question of, all right, so it's done. I'm Jewish, but so what? Because then we have that so what, and I can start to say, that is a huge challenge, but maybe it's an opportunity. Maybe it's the cart and the horse in which goes first. How do I begin to help young learners discover and develop and refine their spiritual signature without necessarily getting into the Jewish specifics that might otherwise start to close them down? So I think my challenge is I want kids connected deeply to God, but God is not Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, as a Jewish day school, our mission is, well, we got to connect into heritage and to tradition. And so we're jumping into the Parsha with those images of God that are really so one-dimensional. And God is so much more than what is captured in the lines of Torah. So I'd say that's one of our challenges, is finding that degree of relevance. If I can give you an anecdote, maybe. This was just, I don't know, two weeks ago. It was shortly before Pesach, before Passover. And I walked into a kindergarten room at our school. And there on the bulletin board was this giant, 4-foot brown paper pyramid. And I get it. We didn't build the pyramids as slaves, but they were already there when we got there. But we know pyramids are symbolic of Egypt. And if I say, give me a symbol of Egypt, 99 out of 100 people, they're giving me a pyramid.
Yeah.
And I saw that, and I was on my way to a 4th grade class, and something just popped into my head. And I arrived, I walked into the classroom, and they said, oh, are we going to continue with X, Y, and Z? And I said, no. I said, we're doing something totally different. And I walked to the board and I drew a triangle. And I said, what is that? It's triangle. These are 4th graders. And I said, I said, but we're out of school in 2 days because of, and they said, well, because we're going to go in for Pesach. I said, exactly. I said, oh, it's a pyramid. I said, yeah, it's a pyramid. And I said, who was in charge? They said, oh, well, Pharaoh was in charge. I said, what were we? Oh, we were slaves. I said, and how did Pharaoh feel about our lives? Oh, could care less about our lives. I said, got it. I said, and then what happened? They said, well, plagues, and we went free. And I said, we went free. And so I drew an arrow from that triangle on the board, and I wrote free. And I said, so we were free to do whatever we wanted, right? I said, just like when I was a kid, right? And I would say, okay, so I went to my parents, I set the table, I made my bed, I did my homework, and they say, okay, you're free to do whatever you want. And I'm thinking, well, I always hated Aunt Shirley's vase that's in the living room. Am I free to go smash that? It's, of course not. We say we're free to go and do, but we're often not. There are constraints. So with the 4th graders, I said, so where'd we go? And they're all kind of looking at me a little blank. And then I just drew another triangle. And they're looking at this triangle on the right representing Egypt and a triangle on the left with an arrow going towards it. And finally, one of them clicks and says, oh, Mount Sinai.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, yes, we went from one triangle to another. And I said, who was the ruler? And they said, God. And I said, and what were we? And then the one kid said, slaves. And I said, no. So we were servants.
Servants, right.
And I said, and they said, well, it's the same thing. And I said, no. I said, if you put in your application to be a servant in the palace, I said, you don't get picked unless you're what? And I said, you're the queen. Who do you get to pick as your servant? They said, trustworthy, someone who's a good listener, someone who's compassionate, somebody who's organized. I said, got it. And I said, and how did God as the ruler feel about our lives? And they said, amazingly.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, we every year celebrate this holiday where we go back to Egypt and we dredge up the past. I said, wouldn't it be so much better just to chuck the past in the trash can and stick with that triangle?
Mm.
And the kids are starting to weigh this. And I said, we go to Sinai, but we go there with the experience of Egypt, of what it meant to be degraded and shamed and lowly. And I said, and we flip that experience on its head. And we remember it over and over. And we say, never again will I be like that. And my mission in life is to take these values of Torah, of what I get at Sinai, and I am supposed to take these and say, based on my experience in Egypt, this is what I'm going to bring to the world. I'm going to teach people about love. I'm going to teach people about service. I'm going to teach people about, covenant and about being in the image of God and about paths of peace and about truth and about integrity, on and on. I said, the Torah is not just some rolled up scroll with a little velvet cover that you parade around the synagogue.
Right.
I said, Sinai represents the values and beliefs that we have an opportunity to bring to the world. And I said, take that upside down Egypt and put it on top of Sinai and you get a Jewish star. So maybe our Magen David, our Jewish star, is saying we have the inversion of Egypt as symbolized by the pyramid. And we say, I'm going to take my experience from that, but I'm now going to take my values of Torah, which are uniquely ours. Even if some of them have universalized out to the world, we've got value after value that are unique to our Torah, that are what we need to be the reflector that shines to the world.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
if we can bring our kids along to that point where they recognize that there has been an ongoing chain unbroken back to the Exodus, back to Sarah and Abraham. That chain only exists if they choose to link theirs to what came before. That their generation is entirely up to them.
Mm.
And so it's, yes, why be Jewish? But it's, look at these values. How could I ever be the one to break that chain of reflecting those values to a wider world until they hopefully are universally accepted?
Well, that's
Right.
deep, and that's our mission, right?
I think
Yeah,
it's,
as you were saying that, I was thinking, there aren't a lot of upside down triangles in the world. And then you said to combine it with the other one, and I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
and
I
it only
really
occurred to me
like
because I
that.
walked into this classroom and saw a paper triangle, and it just popped into my head, and I was trying to think, how do you get to kids and recognize that they have a mission? And I said to these fourth graders, if it feels like I'm putting a little pressure on you, good.
Right.
I said, because it's not on me. I said, my children are the generation older than you. And I said, I've taken care of their generation and I'm helping to take care of yours. But I said, who's taking care of the generation after you? And they said, we are.
Yeah, definitely.
And I said, and that's what it means to stride forward, being willing to take responsibility, even if you're a little nervous. But I said, the stakes are high, but the values that you bring are extraordinary, and they should strengthen you and give you courage every step of the way.
Definitely.
Yeah, it sounds like that would give you some motivation as an educator. Are there
Sure.
any other ways you stay motivated?
I think it all goes back to the kids, right? When you stop and ask kids, where are you and how do you feel and what do you want to know? It puts front and center the reason why I do what I do. And I think it builds the trust and the rapport that enables kind of soulful learning to stick. So if you'd said, how do I stay motivated? A while back, I would have said, well, I read. But I'll be honest, look, I turn on TED Talks. I put on the Eli Talks and all sorts of stuff on YouTube in terms of Jewish living and Jewish learning. But I think I'd also say that folks should put something like Parker Palmer's Courage to Teach on the list. And that keeps up the motivation because he understands the demands of teaching and how, it can lead you to feel like you're burning out. So he understands that reconnecting with our craft and with our students is where educators need to begin. It's a reminder that, we've got to cultivate the learning environment that honors and develops the deepest human capacities, not just in children, but in ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's really uplifting, right? When he urges us to remember that it's the person within the teacher that matters most, right? It's not just you as a teacher, but it's don't forget who you are as a person. And that does help to motivate me.
Right. And it sounds like you really love what you do too, so I'm sure that helps.
Yeah, definitely. How
It
would
helps.
you?
Teaching's a hard task, and we all need it, and we lean on one another. And some at different times, each of us is able to give strength to the other.
Well, I like that you mentioned that because I'm sure there's always new educators joining the field, joining the craft. What advice would you give to them as they're beginning their journey?
Teach what you don't have to unteach later. In other words,
someone else said that same thing.
Well, because if you're teaching something just because it's there on the piece of paper or in the book, or if you don't really believe it, in some ways I think it's I'm afraid to sort of be that open and honest with my students. So respect the learner, right? No matter the age. I mean, yes, my world is the kindergarten to 5th grade, and so to me, respecting the learner means don't dumb it down. Give kids credit for having a deeper spiritual life and a greater potential for understanding that you might assume. And so I'd say to a new educator, remember to respect the learner in the basic sense of that word, respect their capabilities. But I would also say this to a teacher, especially as somebody who started in a middle school and was often overwhelmed by the demands that the institution could require of me, is that respect your students in the basic sense that we use the word respect. Like I said before, you can't unring the bell. You can cancel out when you've given an incorrect fact. You can come back and say, oh, you know what? I said Babylonians, I meant Assyrians. Okay. But the impact of our words and the tone behind them are so keenly felt by kids that we cannot undo them once we've said them.
Right.
So be kind to children.
Do you think sometimes a student can have too many educators? Like it causes confusion because there's so many different perspectives coming at them, and so maybe there's inconsistencies as opposed to having one or a handful of educators for a student?
I think there's something to that, Ari. I think maybe what it takes is just one of those teachers saying, you know what, you're only in 2nd grade, but you're going to have lots of different teachers, and they're going to seem different from time to time. And that's okay. If one of those teachers can deliver that message of, we see things in different ways, right? That's the analogy. It's a great God analogy, by the way, right? The children who are unsighted, the blind children who go to the zoo and they experience the animals of the zoo in a different way. And they come back and the teacher says, so what was your favorite moment? And they say, oh, the elephant. One of the teachers says, what did you love? And he said, well, I loved the fact that the elephant was solid like a tree trunk. And the other one said, what? The elephant was bristly like a broom. And the other one said, no, it was kind of like a wet hose. And where this is going, right? They were all feeling different parts of the elephant.
Right.
And so they were all correct. If we say your teachers don't always see the whole perspective, they're human. When you look from one standpoint, you can't see everything. Somebody's on the other side of the building, you don't see them. So listen to what your teachers have to say. And when you hear them say different things, say, that's interesting. There might be different perspectives. So yes, it could be that one teacher gives them that little key to unlock the difficulty. Then maybe as they go through life, they'll go, oh yeah, I remember that teacher back in 2nd, 1st grade, whatever it was, who said, don't think that teachers are teaching you different things. They're just teaching you different ways that they see it.
I really like that answer. And how do you think that we can help our students really build that proper Torah foundation?
So I like the question. I like the word foundation. Torah leaves me a little bit lost, right? Because those are the keys, right? Torah foundation. The foundation is going to serve to support a student like a foundation does. So then a different perspective might be, what's so special about my Jewish tradition that I should look to it as a foundational layer? the word Torah, what does that mean, right? Because Torah is a catch-all, and it can mean scripture, it can mean ritual, it can mean halacha, it can mean the combination, of Mishnah and Gemara, and so much more. So when you ask, how do we build a Torah foundation? I think I would start to say it has to go beyond the biblical text. But even if we all do focus so much in those early years on the biblical text, we have to ensure that kids see Torah as something that they can connect to in terms of their own worldview, and that there's value in it. Rare is going to be the group that can say, you have to value Torah as a foundation simply because.
Right.
And for our kids, and there are opportunities with this. So to take something like the study of the book of Joshua, which I start to work with third graders on, you could say, so what is this meaning of this battle of for the city of Jericho? And now I can connect that to modern day spirituals like the song Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and talk about the metaphor of walls coming tumbling down. So you can connect it to something which they're seeing throughout history and maybe now echoing in current day. But then you have to also go back and say, but what are we going to do about a God that says, let's kill everybody in the city, including the children? And I'm not going to hide that from a third grader, because we're giving them a book where they can read the English and they can see what's in there. And so now I can start to say, so what does a story like this mean? Does this mean that I can't trust Torah? Or do I say, this was at such a different time, and what do Jewish soldiers do now, right? To go back to the idea of Israel education, that there's a code of ethics that applies to the Israeli Defense Forces that means that should never happen, means we've clearly moved on from it. But why were we so concerned with it then? So when we say a Torah foundation, you have to look at different pillars of support that form that foundation. And each one could be a potential pitfall, but each one can also be another potential point of, I don't want to say rehabilitation, I'll say opportunity, where we can start to make a point of connection so that they say, this is relevant. Take a story like, the friendship of Jonathan and David, and we get a chance to talk about loyalty and friendship, and they can express their perspectives on what they see in life. So now all of a sudden, it's not just a story, but it's a timeless story, and there's certain values in it that are meaningful. So that's one dimension of it. The other piece, though, when I think of a Torah foundation for students, it's how do we get them to continue being Jewish in their lives? And like I said before, part of it is the home. We can only do so much at the school, and we need something to happen at the level of the family.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And we need to get them to experience things, right? We can only do so much unless we get the students to feel like they belong to something, especially. Back when I was getting into Jewish education, a lot of people were sort of having this debate between, beliefs versus actions, and I think probably still some people who still debate that. And do we focus on getting people to believe, and then that'll lead them to do things? Or do we say, let's just get out there and do, and it's going to lead you to believe? And I'm coming at it from the opposite and saying, you know what? Maybe echoes of Ron Wolfson and relational Judaism, and saying, let's get people to just start doing. And even if they don't believe, they'll feel like they belong. So to me, there's the Torah of belonging. And it's not just peoplehood. It can take different avenues through that city. But to me, it's all going to come back to belonging. And that's the strongest foundation, I think, the most lasting one that we can ever hope to build.
Right. That is very interesting. And one of the things we've learned by asking this question to some people is that one of the pillars for this foundation, and you may think differently, but we found that one of these pillars is this idea of Torah mina shamayim, right? Torah coming from heaven. And so obviously we want to be honest with the students. So what happens if, they want to know that information, or, how do you address that?
Kids do ask, right? And we've had kids who they have Bible scholars for parents. And they'll say, so my mom tells me that people wrote the Torah.
Right.
And that's the bell that can't be unrung, because every other kid in the classroom just heard that. And you go, yeah, there are definitely people who believe that.
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, what do you believe? And I'll say, well, let me talk about some of the other positions that are out there. And when they ultimately want to know what I feel, I'll say, ultimately, I don't know. I said, but I like to think that the Torah that we have is the one that God wanted us to have, however it got into our hands. And the how is so much less important than it's there. And we've lived by it. We've died for it. We've cherished it. It's inspired us. It's guided us. So let's open it and let's see what we find in it. And we may find that there's stuff that we don't resonate with. We might find that there's stuff that we had no idea was in there. So we've got parents coming from across the wide spectrum of belief and observance as to the divinity of Torah versus, the authorship. It doesn't seem to be a sticking point for kids. This kind of goes back to the idea of Israel education. There's some current research that seems to suggest that kids at the earliest of age, literally at kindergarten, can say Israel is a place that represents safety for all the Jews, and Israel is a place where it's dangerous to be a Jew. Diametric opposites. And young kids can hold those opposites without any conflict. We have a problem with it when we get older, but kids don't. What if that same premise is true for other things as well? And they can say, well, yeah, there are some very different ways of looking at this book that we consider so valuable. And I don't need to make up my mind about where it came from, because it is what it is. No matter where you are in the world, Jews have the same Torah. And they might look at it very differently, but they read it and they talk about it. They argue about it. And they wonder about it. So that's where I come out on it.
Yeah, no, this is really interesting. I mean, we're running out of time, but we're going to hopefully have you back, because we'd love to continue this conversation.
Well, kol kavod, great respect to both of you for going out there and sort of beating the bushes and finding different opinions out there and sharing it with everybody. The more ideas we can share, the more we can learn from one another. And I look forward to checking out the podcasts that are on your list and hopefully expanding what I'm able to do with my craft and with my kids. Nice. Yeah, that would be great. And just real quick, can you give us an idea? What do you think successful Jewish education in the future will look like? I think Jewish education is going to be that we help kids understand not just the stakes of needing to be the next link in the chain, but why the stakes matter, namely how it and they can transform the world. So to me, I'm going to gauge success if they arrive at that kind of a position. Successful Jewish education is going to transform their character. You can't go to it because it doesn't exist yet, but I did preserve the domain name for a website that I want to develop, because I started having this idea of, I like sports. So if you think of certain athletics, right? Simone Biles is flawless on various of her gymnastic events, or, Djokovic's backhand, or Steph Curry's foul shooting. You get this rhythm because you do it over and over and over until your muscles act reflexively, right? We call it muscle memory. Well, I thought, I don't care about muscle memory as a Jew. I care about character memory. I want kids to get into that moment where they know how to act or how not to act in a reflexive manner. And so character memory. So I grabbed charactermemory.com. I haven't done anything with it yet, but love it. Successful Jewish education is building character memory so that we just know how to do it. Love it. And that character is uniquely Jewish.
Is it using the various midot? And
so a lot of it does depend on coming at it from the standpoint of Musar, but it's also looking at some of those values of Torah, which I think are, some of which are crossover hits into the wider world, but sometimes we have to look and say, maybe they started with us. Am I going to be so bold to say justice started as an idea with us? I might be. I might be willing to make that claim and then say, but justice is far greater than us, but it's also something that the world needs perhaps more than anything else. And you can say, well, why don't I just leave it up to the rest of the world? And I'll say, because we have a Jewish obligation to bring that forward. So successful Jewish education is going to be transforming character with kids understanding why the stakes matter and how they can proceed forward and step boldly towards the transforming that they're able to do.
Wow, yeah. So when they ask, what's the source of that obligation? Do you say God?
Well, I might say, do you feel like that's something that you should do?
Right.
And many kids will simply say, yes. And I'll say, what makes you feel that you should do that? And I'll say, maybe that's God.
Nice. Wow, what a way to end it. Rabbi Galfand, it was an absolute pleasure and honor to have you here on the podcast. And hopefully we'll speak to you soon. And we're looking forward to seeing all the great things that you do.
All right, I appreciate your having me on, Yasmina and Ari. Thank you. Good luck in your further efforts, and Hatzlacha Rabbah. Great luck.
Amen. You as well. Thank you.
Thank you.